Welcome to Pirate Living Podcast. We are your hosts, Kristen and Karan. On this podcast, we are highlighting ordinary people living extraordinary lives. These are pirates who take small, bold actions daily to create social change. Pirate life is all about rebelling and breaking the rules for good. Creating lasting social change starts by first breaking our inner rules. After all, the hardest rules to break are your own. The pirates we highlight have dedicated themselves to creating good trouble.
Today we are chatting with Fanziska Elmer. Franziska is a marine biologist and a climate pirate. She has explored many amazing places on Earth that most people have not seen yet. She has given up the lifestyle to fight climate justice. Franziska is now helping students learn the truth about climate change and exploring solutions together. She's also educating others about our climate through her TED Talk and her podcast, Sargassum. We are thrilled to be talking with Franziska today. So, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, Kristen and Karen. I'm really happy to be here today.
We're excited that you're here. You are very skilled in creating good trouble and are a climate pirate. So, we'd love for you to give us a history of your pirate journey.
Yes, I think my pirate journey started quite early in the beginning of my 20s when I volunteered on an island called Saint Eustatius, which used to be called the Golden Rock of the Caribbean back in the days because it was such an important port to be trading through. But at that moment when I was there, it's just a very small Caribbean island, and I was volunteering for the national park. And together with the other volunteers, we would always call ourselves the Statia Pirate Crew. And we even had a tattoo artist living with us who was one of the volunteers who knew everything about pirates. But my time a pirate identity or life really started about 2 years ago. So after the 2018 IPCC report came out, telling us that we really only have 12 years to fix this and to get a hold on climate change, and that it's actually a lot worse than we thought, and that we have to do a lot more than we thought, that we have to transform. I was very shocked to see that our governments weren't really responding, and that the only person really speaking up at those big meetings was this very young girl called Greta Thunberg, which probably all of you know about. And she actually changed the the conversation about climate a bit, because before it was always like, why do I have to make a change if everybody else profits from it and I have to suffer from making the change? But she asked the questions of, what will you tell future generations, or what will you tell your kids in the future about what you did during this time? So through her and other people, it became really, really apparent that this decade we're living in now is the most important decade we have in human history. And whatever role you're going to play is going to be really important. Whether or not you're taking action, you're inactive, or you're actually blocking action. So I was thinking about all these things while reading the Be More Pirate book, and it really opened my eyes, especially the question about what would you fight for, which means fighting in terms of like it being okay if you lose your job or relationships or reputation over it. And for me, it was clear the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis that we have today, it's so big and it's going to impact my life and future generations' lives so much that all these things like my job, my reputation, relationships, if they cannot stand me fighting for this, they're not worth it. Like fighting for this is what I need to do. And by writing this down and thinking about this and saying it out loud to myself, I realized I can speak up so much more for the climate. Like all these things that make you scared of speaking up normally, well, they're not as important. So why don't I speak up? And that's when I started to become a climate pirate. So from the book, I got inspired to call myself a climate pirate, and decide that would be my role in this really historical decade that we're living in right now.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, go ahead. No, I was going to say, like, that's huge. 12 years is not a very long amount of time to change something.
Yeah, and so once you made that decision, what were the first changes that you made?
The first changes I made, I have to say, at that point, I was teaching marine biology to study abroad students from the United States on a tiny island in the Caribbean called South Caicos in the Turks and Caicos Islands. So I was very much living a piratey lifestyle. Like I was living right on the coast. I was out on the boats a lot. I was snorkeling a lot. We really taught everything we could teach in the water. We would teach them in the water. And one of my lectures was about climate change. And that lecture, as I took it over from people giving the lecture before me, it had a lot of graphs in there on how climate change affects different animals, from plankton to sea stars, how it affects them being able to make their skeletons. So it was actually one of the more boring lectures in my whole repertoire of lectures. And I was like, this is not going to motivate anybody to do anything about climate change. And it's not actually telling the truth either of what's happening. So I completely revamped the lecture. I showed the students this really important graphic that you may have seen of the differences between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming. And that it's a big difference for the coral reefs. Like you either have very little coral reefs surviving at 1.5 or pretty much all of them dying at 2 degrees. And then I asked my students, okay, who all wants to actually study coral reefs for their career? And a lot of them put their hand up. And then I was like, okay, let's have a look. When will we actually hit 1.5 degrees? What are the projections? And I pulled up this clock. You can find it on the internet. It's called the climate clock. And it actually ticks down second to second to when it is predicted that we get there. And the clock showed 11 years. And that's just showing to when 50% of our models will be at 1.5 or over 1.5 degrees Celsius. So it's actually really bad odds. And if you would look at the same clock for only 30% of the models, so giving us a 2/3 chance that we're not above 1.5, then we're down to like 6 or 7 years. So that really hit hard. Like the students were like, wow, okay, we don't have much time. We really need to act now. And then we talked about the different ways that, we think we are doing something for the environment, but maybe we are not. Like people who avoid straws, for example, if they go on a vacation, but never think about how far they're flying. So they think their new vacation is more environmentally friendly because now they're not using straws. But the fact that they maybe flew 1,000 kilometers further has never occurred to them, and that this is actually much higher impact. So we were talking about different things like that. And next to talking to my students about this, I also started talking up in the scientific community. We have an email list where there's thousands of coral reef people on it. And I've never written an email there. Like there's job announcements, there's people discussing stuff. But once the discussion about climate change came up, I actually started writing an email, and it became like one of those viral emails where there's like 10 other people replying, and yes, like we really had to make a difference.
And so, yeah, you were striving to get people to, instead of coming together to in person, to meet virtually. And with COVID this past year, has that affected? Is there more of that conversation for being able to make it work virtually, where you still are able to meet up with other experts in the climate field? Or is that something that seems to be dying away again?
That's a really good question. So yes, in the beginning of me turning pirate, I got to know this other person at Chelsea from Hawaii. So very far away from me, but there was going to be a coral reef scientific meeting, which happens every 4 years, so not that often, but it was going to be in Germany. And she said, I would blow my entire carbon budget for a year just by flying there and back for a week. I want to be able to go to the meeting remotely. This was before COVID happened. And of course, they said, this is impossible. We cannot offer this. So me, her, and another colleague, we decided, well, let's then just make a meeting that we can all go to remotely and have different hubs in different places that are connected. So we started organizing, and then COVID came along, which made it not possible for us to have the hubs. The meeting was last summer, but it made it possible for us to have a quite large meeting with over 150 people presenting, and over 2,000 people signed up to listen, because we made it free for people to access. So it was really, really successful. But it was also in the beginning of COVID, when people weren't tired of Zoom yet. And now I'm part of the Association of Marine Labs in the Caribbean, and we've been talking about our meeting. So every 2 years we have a conference, and it was supposed to be this year, but we couldn't do it in person, and I was the only person who volunteered to help making it virtual, so that didn't happen. So now we're talking about next year. And me and some colleagues, we are the committee that will make it happen, hopefully, to have a hybrid meeting. So people who want to meet in person can meet in person, but it also being available to others virtually. Because some people don't want to fly because of carbon impacts, but there's also a lot of people who cannot afford it. Like a virtual meeting is a lot cheaper, both for the organizers and for the people attending. It's a few, maybe $100 to attend if you have to pay something, versus paying for hotel, for flights, which often goes in $2,000 to $2,000. So it's definitely hard, because some people are very Zoom fatigued in our committee, not in the committee, but in the association. And they just want an in-person meeting. And they don't think that we technically and financially and with the manpower can pull this off. They let us try, and we will make sure it's going to be the best hybrid meeting that we can pull off. And after that, it will hopefully be the new normal, and nobody can think back to not having this. Mm-hmm. But yes, I think the upcoming year, the challenge is to make these meetings hybrid and to fight against the Zoom fatigue that everybody's having, because they literally have, I don't know, 1 to 5 Zoom meetings a day, and all the conferences are on Zoom. Like, it's definitely very heavy on the academic people, because now that we can all meet on Zoom, we are having way more meetings with all kinds of people around the world, which is great, but it's exhausting.
Definitely. I know for us here, we're in Vancouver, me and my family, and my partner hasn't been working in the office since last March. What impact overall do you think COVID has had on climate change. I can only imagine it would be a positive one with less travel, both by air and local, like people working from home. Has it been like given a little break to the climate, do you think?
Yes, it has. So the people have studied this, and we had the biggest dip in carbon emissions ever in this year, which is really good. It is almost as much as the dip we actually need every year to actually reach the goal. So we need about 7.6% reduction every year to get there. And unfortunately, that reduction isn't something that carries over to the next year. Like, unless we keep living like this for the next, until eternity, this will not carry over. And we could have done more in terms of our governments are spending a lot of money to help people with the economic situation of COVID. And we could have done more using that money, not in fossil fuel ways, but really to boost renewable energies. So that was really the big opportunity we had with COVID, is that at once there's trillions of dollars that are flowing, which before were always like, oh, we don't have that money when we talked about climate. So, and we can still change this. Like, it's not that all this money has been spent, and we should really think about spending it more wisely and asking the government to spend it more wisely. But at the moment, it looks like our governments could have done a lot more in using that money simultaneously for COVID recovery and for green jobs and for helping against the climate crisis. And unfortunately, this year, our carbon footprint is already rebounding, and we're not going to go down 7.6% as we should. So, yeah.
What can people do on a personal level? Because yeah, there's the governments and where they put the money in, and we have only so much control there. What can everybody look at personally to help make that impact as well?
There's different things you can do personally. One thing you can do is to work on your own carbon footprint. And the best thing is to use one of the many carbon footprint calculators out there and first figure out what is your carbon footprint. Where do you have a high one? Do you fly a lot? Do you use your car a lot? Do you eat a lot of meat? And you kind of see, where you can improve. Like, is your heating system still oil-based or gas-based? And then think about these things and see where can you make a difference. Big differences you can do is changing your heating, changing the way you go to work, like going by bike or walking if possible is definitely going to be much more impactful. Or if it's far away, maybe you get electric car or ride share, or take public transportation. And then flying, if you are a frequent flyer, that will be a big one. And of course, your diet, like a vegetarian or vegan diet, will make a huge impact. So a lot of people don't really know what the big things are they can do, and they think that stuff like recycling, they're going to make a big difference. But sometimes it's stuff like changing your bank account or telling your pension fund to please not invest all your money into, or some of your money into, fossil fuels is actually having a much higher impact than all the recycling you do all year. And then the other thing people can do is talk about it. So it has been found that in the States, 2/3 of the people never talk about climate change at all in a whole year. So talk to your family and friends about it. Like, say like, oh, have you heard about this happening? Have you heard about this? Positive and negative things. Think about the future you want, and talk with people about it. Talk about the positive things you want for the future, and talk about your fears, your hopes, and yeah, speak up, go to demonstrations, like make sure your voice is heard. Because if you're just by yourself doing your changes, then neither the government will know that you care, nor will your friends and family know that you care, or your local council. And they all need to know that you care.
Mm-hmm.
Because doing these individual changes they're going to be way more impactful if other people see you do them and see you enjoy them. So do things that are enjoyable to you, find ways to make it fun, because then you see one person after the other will also do it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe your sister or your friend will also become vegetarian because of you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that you said, talk about it. I know here on the West Coast, we had recently this extreme heat dome. What is that? What they called it?
I
Extreme
think
heat
so,
dome.
yeah.
And I'm just outside of Vancouver, and there's a town, it's a couple hours away called Lytton, and it broke multiple days in a row. It broke all-time temperature records for Canada, and reaching 49.6 degrees Celsius in
What
Canada.
is that, Fahrenheit?
I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. Really,
It's
really hot. Really hot.
Yeah.
Hotter than like Nevada.
Over 110. So,
Yes.
Yeah, I think it was in the 120s actually.
Yeah, 120 something. And a couple days later, there was a spark, and that entire town, 90% of that town actually burned down. So to say, having climate change being actually on something that's being talked about right now, and this is in June.
Yeah.
Normally in Vancouver, we call it January because, this is supposed to be a temperate rainforest, and here we are, it's the middle of July. We haven't had rain in 28 days. And you can see how quickly things really are changing. And that heat was unbearable. We don't generally have air conditioning and all of that stuff in Canada. We had a lot of people die from the heat. A lot of lives were lost on an entire town. So it is interesting that it's taken something like that to bring that conversation to the forefront, to the point where we were talking about zombie apocalypse movies the other day with some friends, and we talked about what's your scariest apocalypse scenario. Is it zombies? Is it disease? What is it? And it was interesting that a couple people said climate change. And I'm like, well, you know what makes that the scariest is that it's real. It's, the zombies may or may not happen, but climate change is real, and it's happening, and we're seeing the impacts, severely just this year in the Pacific Northwest. And
fire season's already started here.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Fire season is big right now. And where do you see most of that conversation happening in your circles? Like, is there something like an event that's really maybe the coral reefs dying, but where do you see those conversations happening?
That's a really good question. And yeah, the example you just gave, like I was following it with the heat wave and the heat dome, and then I was checking the news, and I saw the news article about the town burning down, and I had to double check if that was real news, because I was like, wait, the town was having a heat wave and now it's actually burned down. This is out of a movie type stuff, but it did happen, and it's extremely scary, and it's really sad and scary that we let things go this far and we're still not really acting. And it's not that all governments decided, okay, we call it a climate emergency now after we see these things, and other people in other countries actually cannot go outside because it's so hot that even a healthy person will die within a few hours in those temperatures. but we don't hear that much about that because it's the global south, and they're used to higher temperatures, while this was really a shocking event.
Mhm.
Oh, where do we talk about climate change and about what? That's really hard, because actually marine biologists, they talk about it a lot and say, oh, we should do something about climate change and we should recycle and be green. But then they don't really talk much about the coral reefs, even though we are coral reef scientists. Like we know it's about the coral reefs and it's about other things. But I'm actually a bit frustrated by a lot of scientists and marine biologists not speaking up, not taking real action, not transforming. And that's why we did that conference, because we want the transformation. But we just go on as if life, it isn't an emergency. And that's why probably the rest of the world also goes on like it's not an emergency, because we scientists aren't speaking up enough.
Mm-hmm.
But luckily I found a group called Scientist Rebellion, which is an offset of Extinction Rebellion, which I was also part of while I was in Switzerland. But they don't have it here in Mexico, so I'm not part of them right now actively. But I'm part of Scientist Rebellion, and it's all about speaking up and making sure that scientists speak up, because people trust us and we know how bad it is.
Mm-hmm.
And we cannot be silent about this.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, we often just talk in our silos or in our bubble about it. And we talk about all the different things that are happening. Hurricanes getting worse, droughts, fires. It's really more of a human crisis than a coral reef crisis to me now, because it affects so many people.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it also affects the coral reef. But also, if the coral reef is gone, it also again affects humans, and talking to other people about how it affects them rather than an animal or an ecosystem is more powerful, I think.
Mm-hmm. That was going to be my other questions. What is the impact of the coral reefs dying?
Mm-hmm.
Well, so the coral reef, normally when you think about the tropics, the coral reef is a barrier between the ocean and the land. So whenever there's a big storm coming in, the coral reef takes a lot of that energy from the waves and lowers those waves so that the land isn't hit as much.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's also a place where fishermen go fishing and the fish live. So there's a lot of substance there that if you don't have the coral reef, you're going to lose a lot of your fish because they like it as a habitat.
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, and maybe one factor that is very important, is tourism and economics. So a lot of places, if they don't have the coral reef, then they lose all the tourism of the people who like to go snorkeling and diving and all that stuff. But the coral reef also supplies the sand for the beaches. So the sand is made out of old corals pooped out by parrotfish. So even the people who just like to lay on the sand and go swimming there, they will not come either to your destination. So it's entire livelihoods and communities and resilience of communities that are at risk here. It's their food supply, it's their security against storms, and it's their income from tourism that's highly at risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I live in Vancouver, but I am from Bermuda. So everything that you just said, really hits home with my home, right? We rely on the tourism and the fishing and, and definitely the break from the storms, which obviously those hurricanes are just getting more and more and bigger, every year as we go along here. So yeah, that really hits home for like where, 90% of my family lives, then now understanding that they will be impacted. by, you know, the death of the coral reefs, like significantly impacted. So I think as much, like you said, humanizing it, personalizing it that we can do, rather than like, oh, the corals are dead. Okay. But what does that mean for us when climate change has this impact? You know, I'd always thought of like, okay, if the sea levels rise, well, maybe we won't have a Bermuda anymore, right? To begin with. So it is great that you put it in those terms of like what the actual impact will be for the people living out there. So it's important. Thank you.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you said sea level rise. I don't know how high Bermuda is in terms of elevation of its tops, but then you have
Not very.
places like the Maldives and other islands which are very, very just like a sandy atoll, right?
Mm-hmm.
And these nations could be entirely wiped out, like entire nations being gone, entire ways of living and culture being lost.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that even just locally here, you know, in Vancouver, living on the coast, we have, you know, these sandy deltas that are, whole cities are made of. That, you know, we've seen the maps that have come out with the rise in sea levels, that even cities in Vancouver here on, you know, on the west coast would be gone.
Mhm.
And so I mean, it's a lot of times if people don't have family or friends or connection to the Caribbean or to an island, they might be like, yeah, no big deal. But when you start looking at like cities, big cities where millions and millions of people live, being gone underwater, you know, that brings it home for even more people, as well.
Yeah,
Yes.
out here on the west coast too, like there's this thing about, well, if the big earthquake comes, like Portland and beyond will be in the ocean, but we don't need that big earthquake to come if the ocean's going to come to us before that.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think when you talk about climate change, make sure you think about the audience you have, like who are you talking to, and try to relate it as much to them as possible. So if I was talking to my town in Switzerland of 2,000 people where I grew up with, I may not talk much about islands in the Caribbean, but I would talk about, you know, stones getting on our roads and making it not possible to go to the neighboring village without having to go around the big mountain on the other side. And just like the more local you can figure out what are the impacts here or to the people that you're talking to, the more impact they will have and the more they will care. And almost everywhere in the world, you will have impacts that are negative, and there's not many positive impacts, unfortunately.
With with that being said, that picture behind you, sargassum. Um, tell us first off, what is it? And then how does that impact climate? Like, what can we learn from it?
Yes, so sargassum is a brown algae. It's a type of algae, a seaweed, that is actually quite special. So there's lots of different species of sargassum, but the one you see behind me and the one we talk about in our sargassum podcast mostly is the one that is always free floating in the ocean. So it's never attached to the bottom, it's always on the top of the ocean. And as such, it can use the entirety of the ocean, which most other seagrasses and seaweeds, they can only be in the really shallow parts of the ocean. And then there's not enough light for it to grow. Karen probably knows sargassum pretty well, having grown up in Bermuda, where they have it naturally occurring since Columbus was going to America for the first time, and probably way earlier than that even. We don't know, we just don't have the records. But there's the sea called the Sargasso Sea that is in the northern Atlantic, and it's a gyre. So all the currents go to the middle and keep the sargassum in there. It's a really big area, and Bermuda is part of it. And there, Sargassum is a really important ecosystem with a lot of animals in it and helping fisheries and so on. However, in 2010, 2011, the Atlantic currents were not as strong, and there was quite some strong winds, and that made a patch of the Sargassum actually leave the Sargasso Sea and drift over to the northern part of Africa. And then from there, the normal currents of the Atlantic picked it up and put it down into the tropical Atlantic, where it's a lot hotter, there's upwelling, so there's more nutrients, and the Sargassum loved it. So in the Sargasso Sea, it doesn't grow very fast. It kind of stays the same. But down there, it just like grows exponentially super fast. And then every summer, well, starting in March and ending in October, really. So it's a very long summer, if you want to think about it as summer. This belt of Sargassum that's in the tropical Atlantic gets pushed both to the African coast and towards the Caribbean and the Central American coast. And there you have this huge influx of Sargassum. So instead of just having a little bit of Sargassum arriving on your beach, like you know from Bermuda and people have known in the Caribbean for a long time, you now have this stuff arriving knee high, hip high, and yeah, too much to deal with, and then it's decomposing and it's killing everything that's close to shore by decomposing and making the water anoxic, so without any oxygen. It is really bad for tourism. Think about stinking seaweed on the beach and in the water. Nobody wants to be there. The news about that spreads really fast, and it's also the fumes that come off it are bad for people's health. So it brings some people to the emergency room if they inhale too much of these fumes, because it's hydrogen sulfide and other gases. And it also impacts your electronics. So if you have a restaurant or a house nearby, well, you will have to change your air conditioning, your fridge very more frequently because of the sargassum.
Is that because of the corrosive nature of the H2S? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So it's a huge problem, but at the same time, the algae itself has a lot of really good properties. So there's a lot of things you can make out of algae, including the sargassum algae. So if we collect the sargassum before it hits the beach and we use it as a resource, we could have a completely new blue economy for these areas, and making these areas, which are now really dependent on tourism as for income, less dependent on tourism, but have a second big income strain. So there's small companies who've come up with solutions, from fertilizers to making paper, to making shoes, animal feed, soaps, and skin products, all kinds of stuff you can make out of it. And so there's some small companies out there. There's some startups who want to make bigger companies and scale ups, like with real refineries. And our podcast is all about talking about these solutions and talking about the challenges and sharing that information in the podcast format that's archived and accessible to a lot more people than webinars or conferences, so that a person living in St. Lucia can learn about somebody in Mexico and what their solution is, and be inspired and be like, wait, we can make something out of this. Or they can learn about, hey, in Barbados, they're using rum distillery waste water and sargassum, and they're going to make fuel out of this. Well, we could do that too in the Turks and Caicos Islands, you know?
That's really cool and exciting too, that something that it looks like a giant problem can actually be turned around into a big opportunity to even help with the climate crisis to give people different ways of creating and getting that, taking that and changing things. So that is cool too, to be able to look at something that looks like a problem and flipping it into an opportunity.
Yes, it for sure is. And it's exciting to work on this because the other research I've been working on was coral reefs and coral diseases as they were emerging on our reef. And there's no other side of the coin for coral diseases. It just means, you're losing your corals even faster than just with climate change. So having the sargassum as a research project, it has this exciting side of we can actually turn this into opportunity.
Mm-hmm. So you've taken a lot of bold actions. What are some of the small, bold actions that you're currently taking right now as a climate pirate?
Probably a big bold action that took a while ago was to quit my job and go on a climate change sabbatical, what I called it, and just volunteering for different projects and doing activism. And that's what I was up to in 2020 mainly. And it really helped me find my niche in the climate movement. So I found out I'm really good at giving talks.
Mm-hmm.
Hence, I also got to give a TED talk, a TEDx talk. So I knew that that was a good niche for me. And especially in Switzerland as a marine biologist, but also elsewhere, people like to hear from us because we have an exciting career. So I can always talk about the marine life and the coral reefs and then bring it back to climate change. I also understood that, for activism, working with Extinction Rebellion and Scientist Rebellion, I do like to do the direct actions. And I can find jobs in those direct actions that suit me, like giving talks or being the person who talks to passerbys to be like, hey, do you want to know what's going on here? And then talk with them for 5 or 10 minutes about how they feel about climate change.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the little bold actions I take. Now I'm in Mexico and I'm still working on my Spanish, so it's a bit harder to talk to people in person about this. But what I do is we talk about climate change on our podcast from time to time, and I do some craftivism. So because I make little kites out of wood, and like they're like a little kite out of wood and then I put a slogan about climate on it, and then I hang it on a tree somewhere where people walk by. It's a really small thing, but I hope a lot of people see it. So it's small bold actions that just get people to stop in their step and get out of their routine and think about climate change for a moment.
Mm-hmm. What does it say on the kites?
So the kite says in Spanish, if we have how can I say it? It's just it pretty much is really short and bold. It says sea level rise equals to no more beaches. Take climate action now.
Gotcha. So again, appealing to what it matters to them locally.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, because we have a beach here. Of course, at the moment, nobody's swimming in it because it is full of stinky seaweed. But once people want to swim in it again, we're going to lose that beach here. And the tourist industry is completely dependent on the beach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's it's hitting me again, like the levels to the coral reef of how like it's not only the rise of the seawater, it's also that you've got the parrotfish who are eating the dead coral and pooping it out so that you get the sand. So if they don't have something to feed on, you don't have sand. So the water levels may rise, and yes, that's scary. However, you also aren't going to get the sand that you like if we don't have the coral reef. So there's so many levels to it.
Yeah, in Bermuda, I mean, sand is what we're all about. Our beautiful pink sand, and our parrotfish are they're protected in Bermuda, and they're just loved because we know how important they are. And you see everybody post, because obviously a lot of my family's there. You see everyone posting their blurry pictures of parrotfish swimming in the water underneath from above, and they're beautiful, and they're something that's protected and revered. I know back home, to helping us make our beautiful pink sand beaches that we love so much.
Mm-hmm.
Well, where can our listeners go to find out more about you and about climate pirates, about sargassum? I have a hard time saying that fast. To find out and learn more about what they can do as well.
Yes. To find out more about me, I have my personal website, which is franziskaelmer.weebly.com, I think. So they can find out a lot about me, and I normally post a few videos on there as well from things I did. I'm also on social media. So I'm on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Instagram. On Instagram, I'm shooting Sea Star. And to find out about the climate pirates, it really was more of the climate pirate movement. Until now, it was more of a club at the study abroad program I was teaching. And then with COVID, it started into a newsletter for students who used to go to the study abroad program. Now they just finally opened up again to have students there. So I think it will turn into a in-person club again. We have a social media account, but nobody's working on it. So you will not really find much about it. But yeah, just be the best climate pirate you can be. Like, think about telling the truth, telling good stories, and telling stories of people making a change, and actually asking for change. And if you can, just be the change and make the change, like we did with the conference. Like, if there's something you want to have changed, and you can potentially do it, even if you've never done it before, just do it. So yeah, if to learn more about climate pirates, just become one yourself, I would say. And to learn more about sargassum, I would highly recommend, if I can plug it, to listen to our podcast. I mean,
I
there's
recommend too.
yeah, there's a lot of other great resources out there to learn about sargassum, but listening to our podcast, the Sargassum podcast, and following us on social media is definitely a great way to learn about it.
Yeah, I watched one of them on YouTube, and so I learned a lot from it. So I also recommend go listen to the podcast, and I'll put a link too so that people can get to it.
Okay, well, one last question we have for you. It's a very important question. Do you know any pirate jokes?
Yes, I do. And this joke is actually from a really good friend of mine, a diver and illustrator from the Turks and Caicos Islands. And I've met her on this 1 week research cruise. We were diving on East Caicos, which is one of the largest uninhabited islands in the Caribbean. And there has been almost nobody diving there before, and we got lucky, and we got to help out on this cruise to look at the reefs and figure out what's there in terms of corals and fish. And in the evenings we would play games and drink some beer, and she would tell a ton of jokes. Like, that is her thing. And one of her jokes, and one of my favorite, is this pirate joke, which is, what is a horny pirate's nightmare?
What?
A sunken booty with no, a sunken chest with no booty.
Oh, that's a good one. I haven't heard that one.
I can imagine it being told too. Thank you, for coming on and for talking with us. Learned a lot today about where about the climate, about things that we can do, and also some of that. There's some fear there, but there's also hope within it too. So thank you for sharing with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to be here.